Okay, so we're almost started on time. Let's see, 5 minutes. No big deal in the life of a cockroach. So this is an extraordinary topic you've had because I don't believe I've directly ever talked about it before. And I was really surprised when I looked at your itinerary for the day because I am talking to a group of enlightened beings here because you're going to have discussions and perhaps arguments about awakening. And I've never really had a direct discussion about awakening. And I certainly haven't had any arguments, because in order to have an argument, you actually have to know what you're talking about. I thought about this. I don't normally think about Dharma talks. I think about a topic. I think about some cogent points of that topic that I want to cover. And then I ramble all over the place. Any of you that have ever heard one of my Dharma talks knows that. The only talent I have is always getting back to the beginning. The first thing that entered my mind when I realized that you were going to talk about awakening, I've got that right, don't I? I hope.
Yes.
Okay. Is that I want to discuss briefly my first awakening and subsequent awakenings and the Buddha's awakening. And I know you're going to talk about this during the day. I have to be honest with you. I could really see, at least from my standpoint, of taking a good week, twice a day during a retreat, talking about this topic. And here we have a day where you have a number of other things that you're going to be doing, walking, meditation, drinking tea, being mindful, all of this business. So let's talk about the Buddha's awakening first, the classic awakening. And I have to give you, well, wait a minute, let me go back and tell you about my first awakening. Then I'll talk about the Buddha's. I was 16 years old and I became concerned. I was a good little kid. I got baptized as a Methodist while I was living with my grandmother, who raised me half the time. And then I started going to some other churches with friends, not so much the Methodist church, because I later discovered in adulthood that they're very liberal compared to, say, the Baptist or the Pentecostal. And when I went to these other churches with friends, the first thing I discovered is everybody's going to hell, except the guy screaming at us up at the front of the room and the people going, hallelujah. They are all going to get to go to heaven. And because of this, I wanted to understand. You see, I just read first hero in my life. I've had very few heroes. My first hero was a man by the name of Mohandas Gandhi. And I had read his biography, which if you've seen the movie, you don't have to read the biography because it's scripted straight out of his book. And it's a wonderful movie also. I couldn't understand why Gandhi was going to hell. Okay, it was just that simple. Why is Gandhi going to hell if he's not an avowed Christian? Now, Gandhi used to tell people that he was a Christian and he was a Jain and he was a Buddhist and he was a Muslim and he was all these other things because he didn't believe in the walls we put up between ourselves and other people. So I got a little book on comparative religions. I remember it was a paperback. It was a high school library. I visited that library on a regular basis and I started reading, and I don't remember. I think maybe I read about the Hindus first. And then I decided I didn't need to read about the Christians because I actually thought I knew what a Christian was. Today, I realize I have no idea what a Christian is because there's well over 200 denominations to the Protestants alone. But I skipped that, and then I read about Buddhism. And my first awakening, which sometimes I use the word epiphany, was when I read this Buddha story and he talked his awakening, which was to realize the Four Noble Truths in the Eightfold Path. And I read the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and I have to tell you, for almost all of my life, I've never understood why people don't understand that. It is so obvious, so straightforward, so simple, so easy to understand, and so hard to practice that I could not understand why people didn't get it. And they always focus on the wrong thing. They see people bowing to a gigantic statue and it's, oh, idolatry. I can remember working as a mechanic. The first half of my life, I worked as a master technician. And I worked next to a guy who informed me that I was a heathen because I worship statues. And I said, no, I don't. Oh, yes, you do. Just like the Catholics, they worship statues. I said, no, they don't. But he wasn't going to hear anything of it because he was one of those fundamentalist guys. That was my first epiphany. And here is why it was an epiphany or an awakening. And if you want, you can call it a small enlightenment. And I'm going to tell you something, then I'm going to come back to it later and amplify on it, is that, and I have so many things I want to say in a little tiny spot. And I have to tell you this, because all of you are studying with somebody. You're not all studying with the same person. I know that because I know some of you, and some of you have done a lot of reading, and some of you have some very strong opinions. I've heard you argue about them. Is when you go to study with a teacher, and I'm talking from a Zen standpoint, because the sign in front of my temple says the Desert Zen Center, and I'll come back to what I'm talking about, but I have to tell you this, as a young monk, people would come to my temple and they'd say, how do you pick a teacher? How do you pick a master? And then they would do the thing that I didn't even want to touch. How do you know if somebody's enlightened? And I really didn't know how to answer that. And I thought about it because I kept getting asked. And I finally said, I don't know how you can know if somebody's enlightened unless you're enlightened yourself. I just don't know how that would work. But I can tell you how to pick a teacher. You have to pick somebody that you have an affinity to. There has to be a feeling of connection. And the second thing is, if everything they believe and everything they say to you, you agree with, it's a waste of time to study with them. You really have to find somebody that you disagree with. And as a student, your job is to try to understand why they said that. And I think of this nun that came to study with me, and she was here 4 years living with me. And when she came here, she'd studied with other teachers. She was very disillusioned and very unhappy. She cried a lot. And I used to make her lunch every day, and we'd sit and she'd tell me all the things that were wrong with her practice and her life. And I told her, I said, you're not always going to agree with what I say. And it doesn't bother me if you don't agree. Just don't argue with me. Don't get upset. Don't get angry. If you don't understand why I'm telling you something or I want you to do something a certain way, think about it for a while. Be honest with yourself. See if you can understand why I said I wanted it this way or that way. And then if you come to the conclusion that I'm an egomaniac and that you shouldn't be listening to me at all, that's okay. Just go on and live your life and do things as you would do them. But once in a while, you're going to realize, if you're very honest with yourself, that I'm right. It may take a couple, 3 years, but you'll say, well, he had a good reason to have me do that. And when she left, she told me, thank you for that advice, because a lot of times they just very strong woman. Her and Gloria Steinem would have lots of things to talk about. And very knowledgeable woman, had a master's degree, and she disagreed with me a lot because she definitely had her own worldview. And that was okay, because my job is not to change anybody's worldview. So I had this epiphany, and this epiphany or this awakening or this enlightenment experience, this is how I judge whether something is actually real. And this is very difficult because I don't consider myself to be enlightened. Did it change my life? Now, this is very dangerous ground to walk on, because if you went up to the guy on the corner with the pamphlets telling you you're going to hell, he would start to testify to you that when he found Jesus, it changed his. and everything was different now, and he's happy and he's going to heaven and he knows it, but I'm not, etc. So how did it change my life? Well, the great master Hakuin said, it's just as if you turned around and looked back where you came from, that it's a completely total shift in your view of the world. And in the process of doing that, it's a total shift in your view of yourself. I was 16 years old. I used to say 15, but I realized that's when I started high school. I was 16 years old, and I was a member of the Methodist Church. I was a leader in the youth group. We got a baseball team because of me. I wasn't a very good baseball player, but boy, I was out there cheering. And we did all kinds of things in the youth group. And I was very comfortable with it, except this thing about going to hell. And I wasn't worried about going to hell. I wanted to know why you were going to hell. And so I read this book. And in reading the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, I changed the way I looked at everything. Now, understand, I'd never met a monk. I'd never met a Zen master. I'd never met any kind of religious leader other than a Christian minister. So I wasn't being influenced by any outside source other than simply reading the story of the Buddha. And I laid in my bed that night and I gave up everything that I believed. And I had a sleepless night. And it's the first time that had ever happened. And I don't ever remember having an experience like that again. But I got up in the morning, it was Saturday, threw my paper out, came back, took a shower, got dressed, went over to the church, found the assistant minister, who, by the way, I had been studying with every Saturday morning because I told him I thought I wanted to be a minister. Yes, I have a leaning that way. It comes naturally. And I said to him, I'm no longer going to be a member of this church. I want you to take my name off the rolls. And he was very surprised. And he said, why? And I said, because I don't believe this anymore. And I explained to him what had happened to me. And he said, well, why don't you just give it some time? He was a good counselor. He said, why don't you give it some time? Don't do it right now. Wait and see if you still feel like this later on. I said, nope, I know how I feel. And so all of a sudden, there I am, the only Buddhist going to my high school, the only Buddhist living in my neighborhood, and I had no idea who the hell I was. Because knowing the Four Noble Truths in the Eightfold Path doesn't tell you how you believe about anything else. And for the next few years, I read D.T. Suzuki, which is a wonderful experience for anybody that doesn't know anything about Buddhism, because I had a very good friend who was a nun, and she used to say, right here, this is where I experienced D.T. Suzuki. I get a headache there that I cannot control. And of course, D.T. Suzuki was a wonderful scholar and philosopher. He was really a lousy teacher of Buddhism because he didn't feel Americans, if you've read enough of him, he didn't really feel that we could practice Zen, that it was just something only Asians could pull off. Of course, he was wrong. So that was my epiphany. That's what I understood. And I say this to you, when I see a student of mine starting to change the way he approaches the world, starting to see things slightly different. And sometimes I have a wonderful monk living with me right now. And I would say once a week at least, he'll say to me, I understand what you've been trying to teach people. He doesn't usually say what you've been trying to teach me, because what he's learning from is me working with other people that are unhappy with their life. And you have to know that if you're going to be involved, some of you are involved with the temple, some of you have goals of being involved with the temple as some sort of leader. Our function is to run a place where a lot of unhappy people come. It's just the way it is. And so I'm working with unhappy people for a variety of reasons, and he's watching me work with those people. And my goal is to help move them towards happiness. My goal is not to tell them how to lead their life. That's something they're going to discover, but I do introduce them to the Four Noble Truths. I complained to Kozin here a couple of years ago. I said, my feeling is that most of the places that call themselves Buddhist study centers which are usually Zen centers, don't teach Buddhism. I had a friend tell me that he lived for a long time at the Zen Center of San Francisco. And he said, nobody would ever talk about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path at the Zen Center of San Francisco because they just wouldn't do it. It's all about Zen. Well, let me tell you what Zen is, or what Vipassana is, or what mindfulness is, whatever that means to you. All things are just like Tai Chi, and I see on your little schedule you're going to do Qigong, and Tai Chi and Qigong are related. And it's just like doing Judo, and it's just like doing Taekwondo, and it's just like Jean-Luc on his bicycle or his kayak. These are activities that you do, and there's a purpose behind the activity. I'm getting a little older now, so I get up in the morning. I have probably everything wrong with me except I'm not diabetic. Kozen gets to have that one. Okay, but people say, what's wrong? I said, you don't even want to see the list. And so I get up in the morning and I do push-ups and I do squats, hanging on to a counter because, I'm an ex-paratrooper and we used to do hundreds of push-ups and run 5 miles every day just to warm up. And here I am doing squats and push-ups against the kitchen counter. And I've got 3-pound weights in each hand and I'm doing curls. So you can imagine what a powerful human being I am at this stage in my life. But that's an activity to stay healthy. That's an activity to keep moving because the secret to the game of life is to keep moving. All of these different activities have great value. But, I think gardening has great value and washing dishes. I had someone call me up 3 days ago. He has cancer. He's had number of operations. They've gone in and removed part of a lung. He's a wonderful man. He's a contractor. He's roughly my age. And he's been coming here to this center with his wife for about 15 years. And he called me up and he said, Mary and I were talking. I just wanted to thank you for what you taught me one time and all the teachings you've given. And I said, oh, well, gosh, how are you doing? Because that's the first question I asked him. I said, Ron, how are you? Rob, not Ron. And he said, you were talking one time about when things get rough, when we get depressed or we get overwhelmed by life, and your advice was go wash the dishes. And I said, uh-huh. And he said, thank you so much for that advice. I just interrupted. I've been vacuuming the house because that's my chore for this morning. Now, this is a wonderful man who has done all kinds of things around my temple. We built things together and he's built things all on his own. And that's the lesson I gave him. Go wash your dishes. And that's a good enough lesson. There doesn't have to be any theological aspect to this. It doesn't have to be any earth-shaking thing. A monk came to the master one day and said, I'm new at the temple. What do you advise me to do? I need to know your first teachings. Now I'm going to tell you something I've never told anybody before. Because if you have one idea of what enlightenment is, you're missing the point because you should have no idea. You should be experiencing it. I was roughly 24 years old riding on a Greyhound bus. My motorcycle had broken down. I'd lost all the money I had in a musical production. And I was on my way back to Long Beach and I was thinking about a pistol that I owned and I was going to put it to my head because I thought my life was over with. I've never told anybody this before. It's the time that I almost committed suicide. And in my little bag that I carried with me was a book from Peter Popper Press on Zen, probably still available. It's in our library here. You can look at it. And I carried that for a year in my pack in Vietnam. And I got it out and started looking at it as I was riding back. And I came up to the story of the monk who went to the master and said, I'm new at the temple. And I don't understand your practice. Please tell me what to do. And the master said, have you eaten your dinner? And the monk said, yes, I have. He said, go wash your bowl. And I just got the feeling again. I got an overwhelming feeling, and life wasn't so bad. And I got back home and I started looking around because I'd stopped working at what I was working at, and I got a job as a commercial fisherman a few weeks later. And I had a wonderful, wonderful time for a year until I moved on to something else. That was at least my second epiphany. It saved my life. We don't get merit badges for this. We don't get certificates. I read Three Pillars of Zen when I was a kid, and it talked about how they'd have these retreats, these Soto and Rinzai masters, and at the end of the retreat, they'd bring people out and march them around in the Zendo and say, okay, these people had an awakening. I read that when I was a kid, and I read it now a couple of years ago. We went through that book in our Sunday school study, and I still don't get it. Why would you want to make somebody stop what they were doing? If you did have an epiphany, let's just push on to the next one. The great master Hakuin, 18th century revolution took place with him as he got the people in the Rinzai school to stop arguing and start doing some meditation. He discovered that meditation wasn't a singular event, that meditation was an ongoing process. No, I'm sorry, enlightenment wasn't a singular event, it was an ongoing process. Because he had gone to a master who worked very hard trying to understand. Now, he had some problems. He was bipolar and all this sort of stuff, because the majority of people are healthy and don't have any problems, right? We got one counselor in this group minimum and probably more. And of course, we know we're all screwed up. It's just like I have people coming in talking about how bad their childhood. Well, welcome to the world. Everybody's childhood was bad. Well, I got beaten. Well, so did I. Well, this went on. I was hungry. Well, oh yeah, I remember that. Okay, life is pretty rough in the beginning. The best thing that happens is you become an adult, maybe, and you start taking responsibility for your actions. So Hakuin, he was certified as being an enlightened master. And this is where American Zen goes wrong. They think that's the point of the practice of Zen, is to be certified as a master. That's a bunch of baloney. We're back in the dojo again. Well, I've got a brown belt. Now I've got to get a black belt. Now I've got a black belt. I've got to get a red belt, because this is the whole purpose of life, is have something to show off to people that I've accomplished something. And that's not the purpose of Zen, and it's not the purpose of Buddhism. The purpose of both of those is to be happy. The practice of Zen is a technique so you can learn who you are. You don't have to know who anybody else is. You have to know who you are. Why did you do that thing that you are sorry you did? I have 3 key practices that I share with everybody to the point where they want to scream. And these are the practices that I teach at our center. And I want to say, so you can have an awakening. The first is you need to do some meditation. Now, so that you don't know, you can do other things. You can do the guided meditation thing where you talk about everybody's going to be happy, everybody's going to be free, which drives me out of my mind. I go to a Theravada temple and they're sitting there doing this guided meditation. I'm going, please shut up and just let me meditate. But you can do that. You can do visualizations. You can do a mantra in your head over and over again. My master used to sit in meditation and he would see the Western paradise. He'd see the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin, and he would see the colors radiating from the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin, and he would see Amida moving in the background. He'd do all this other kind of, you can do any kind of meditation you want to do. You can do the meditation of listening to the bell, of looking at a bowl of water, which they use in the Pure Land School. You can do all of these things. These are just an attempt to see yourself. Don't do meditation to understand why your husband or your wife is a pain in the neck. Do meditation to understand why you're a pain in the neck. Okay, once you understand why you do things, then you'll start to understand why other people are doing things, because every good thing that happens is in you and every bad thing is in you. And you can learn about the world just by studying yourself. The great master Dogen said, to study the self is to study the Buddha, to be enlightened by 10,000 Buddhas, to become awakened. So how do we pull this off? Now, this business of awakening is a reoccurring event, because Hawkwind went down the road and had another enlightenment experience, because he went to a master. He walked up, he wanted to tell him, hey, I'm a totally enlightened guy. And I get to sit up on the veranda with you, and I see that you're wearing some pretty fancy robes, kind of look like they're purple to me. I'm going to get me a set of those robes, and I'm going to sit up on the veranda with you. And the master said, you look to me as if you're a ground dwelling demon. Go away. And Dogen, not Dogen, you have to make allowances for my age. I get confused a lot. So Hakuin, he didn't know what to do. And this guy, he thought, this guy's an enlightened master, and he doesn't recognize that I'm an enlightened master. What's going on here? And back, and the guy kept telling him to go away, and he couldn't figure out what was going on. And then as he thought about it, Hakuin had still shared with his Rinzai school that enlightenment is not a singular event. Enlightenment is something that happens over and over again if you're truly looking at yourself and the world around you. And so for the rest of his life, he had multiple enlightenments, and he told his students, this is normal. This is what happens. There are still lots of Rinzai masters that think if they have an enlightenment experience, they're done studying. They don't need a master anymore. They don't need a teacher anymore. They're there. They'll hang the shingle out and say, here I am, come and study with me, because I'll give you that black belt, or I'll give you that fancy hat to wear, or that special robe, and then you can be like me. You can be special. I think that awakening experiences happen to people all the time. I think epiphanies happen to people all the time. I think most of the time we don't know what to do with them. You realize something and you look around and there's nobody to tell you or explain what was that you realized. A teacher is only there as a coach. One of the things that I'd like to point out to people, that if you're playing basketball, which I loved, and by the way, I was lousy at because I have no depth perception and never have had. The only reason my eyes are straight right now is because I had 2 operations on them a few years ago because I was getting so disoriented. But I like to point out to people, because almost everybody has experienced this. I don't care whether you've done martial arts, you've done some health routine, or you've done some sport. If you have to think about it, you blow it. Think about that. If you go out and you're going to shoot a basket and you have to think about what you're doing, you're going to miss. Well, that's pretty well the way life is. If you have to think all the time about what you're going to say or what you're going to do, you're probably going to blow it. Now, my advice to people is, if in doubt, just be quiet. But you have to have my 3 things are, you have to have some meditation in your life, or whatever you define as meditation, or religious practice. It could be chanting. The Vietnamese, their chanting is their meditation. You have to have reflection every day in your life. Now, I'm not saying you have to feel sorry for yourself every day. I'm saying you have to have some reflection. It may only be a minute. It may be so quick that it's over with before it even starts. But I want to tell you a story. You know what? I don't have my watch out, and Kozen will chastise me for months. Oh gosh, I'm already over time. So, well, I picked up my 5 minutes. According to my watch, it's 9:35, and I started at 5 after. So, like I said, this topic goes everywhere. But the Buddha practice, try to wrap this up and give you 5 minutes of questions, because where is Kozen? He's around here somewhere. I saw him. Well, maybe he's taking his nap now.
Ty, you have time. You're all right.
All right. Okay. Well, um, I want to tell you a quick story about reflection. If you think you don't need it, you're the most extraordinary person in the world. Years ago, I retired after 25 years as a high school teacher. And we had a coffee club at the school, and you gave one of the secretaries $5, and they'd take turns buying the coffee once a month, and they'd get it started in the morning when they came in, and the teachers would go in, and there was a basic rule that if you took the last of the coffee in the pot, then you had to make a new pot. It's a good rule for a club. And we had a coach that would come in. He was the head football coach. He was about half again bigger than me, and I'm a big guy. Just think Kozin. I'm the little brother of Kozin because he's about the biggest guy I know that's still walking around alive. And so I went in to get a cup of coffee one morning. Now, we had three gals that worked in the attendance. We had 4,000 kids at this school. We had three women working in the attendance office. And I was in there. I'd taken the last of the coffee and I was making another pot of coffee. And she came in and she started giving me a really hard time. She talked about all the lazy teachers and how they didn't carry their weight and how they wouldn't make coffee and they always left the pot empty on the burner and the coffee was burning and all this kind of stuff. And I kind of barked at her big time. And I am a big guy and I'm pushy and I'm loud. And I barked at this gal and I left with my cup of coffee after having made a pot of coffee. And then later on, I reflected on what a jerk I was that I had, because obviously, see, she wasn't used to anybody biting back. And so next day, I got up really, really early. And I had heard, you have to know that I'd heard that she spent some time crying after I did that. And she was a nice lady. She was just having a bad morning. And so I got up the next day and I went to a flower shop that was opened early and I bought some flowers for her. And I went back in the morning and a card, and I'm really bad about cards, but I got a card and I said, I'm sorry for being a jerk. And I gave that to her in the morning. And I found out that she no longer thought I was a jerk and she was happy and it made her day. Okay, who was at fault? I was at fault. It didn't matter that she was all over the top of me about making coffee and teachers were a bunch of lazy bums. You are responsible for every action, good and bad, that you do. If somebody gives you a hard time and you overreact to it, it's your fault. It's not their fault. Okay. So to me, that's the enlightened way. Everybody's got a different approach. Everybody's got a different opinion. And I'm going to tell you right now, the last thing that is important for you is to be honest. You need some kind of practice. I don't care what it is. You can be meditating, you can be chanting, you can be lighting candles, you can do 108 vows every morning like the Koreans do. You need a practice. Your practice may be working in a soup kitchen. Your practice may be learning not to take yourself so seriously. You need reflection on what went on today. And you need to try to understand other people because other people are you. Scientifically, we know there's no difference between anybody. Race doesn't exist. We've finally done away with that one. We all have the same genetics. We all came from a common mother. Science just keeps reinforcing this. And if you believe in physics, we're all connected from one end of the universe to the other. So what is the big argument about? Why do we dislike people? Because they have the bad part of our nature. And why do we admire people? Because they have the good part. Enlightenment is simply paying attention and being honest and reviewing what went on that day. So that is my talk. And he said I have a little time, so I'm going to say I have 5 minutes if you want to tell me I'm wrong, which I'll agree with you with. So you got 5 minutes for questions or comments. And then I want to have to sign off because Kozin will be sending me emails for the next week.
Thank you, Roshi. The most wonderful talk. Does anybody have something they'd like to add or question for Roshi? We have time, so please feel comfortable to do that. Tai Kozin.
It is said when the Buddha became enlightened that he says, I was, am, and will be simultaneously enlightened with all things in the universe. What's your commentary on that?
Are you wearing glasses now?
Yes.
Huh. Well, first of all, how do you separate yourself from anybody else? You can't. And what he was saying was, this is his first magnanimous comment on the Buddha nature of everyone. Everyone has the ability to be awakened. Everybody has the ability to be happy. All Buddhism is about happiness. That's what the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path boil down to. If you're unhappy with your life, do something about it. Don't complain, because complaining is just a waste of time. So that's what I think the Buddha meant. Kozin likes to say, everything is good, everything is good. I worry about him sometimes because he says it too much sometimes, which to me, I want to believe that everything's good. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Nope.
I have a question.
Yes.
Go ahead, Leslie.
Yeah. Lately in my life, there's been a lot of discussions between me and people at work or friends and neighbors or whatever about race and ethnicity and relationships. And some of what I need to know how to do is how to respond to people when they're talking about feeling very sensitive about their race or ethnicity and wanting to be, I guess, treated a certain way, and in wanting to be loving and sensitive, trying to do that. But at some point, people are wanting to be put in affinity groups according to their own race and ethnicity. And I'm wondering, how do we have these discussions? And is there ever a time when we put people together that are different from each other and be able to hear each other's core stories and actually develop, is it possible to develop some kind of healing or understanding? Or is it just always going to be unresolved and we just all need to kind of stay in our groups? And so there's a lot of questions. I'm living in Portland.
What's your question?
My question is, because I've been dealing with this a lot, and you mentioned that there wasn't any race, but in Portland, there's lots of racial expressions of, you know, like I'm in a racial justice, inclusion, equity group, and there's been lots of discussions about it. And I'm trying to figure out how to navigate it. That's my question. How do you navigate that?
Could I add something to that?
I don't know. We don't have time.
Sure.
So like people, and I thought we were over racism and stuff, but it's like there's so many people now trying to create specialty groups and racism and, you know, every other aspect of life. People want to be special, and they're actually, I see it, they're actually racist by pushing us.
I'm wanting to know what the Zen and Buddhist way is. You know, what is the loving response to this question?
Well, that's an awful big question, because it's almost like, you know, I want to say, and I'm not going to do that, but, you know, give me an example so I can. But as you're talking, I'm thinking about, yes, we live in difficult times now. And we are, I'll give you a little of my personal view of the world. We are the most spoiled group of people that ever lived on this earth. Americans have more than anybody else, and we don't recognize it. We don't see that we can eat what we want to eat, live where we want to live. Okay, yeah, it's a tough time now. Some of you are out of work. You're not starving. I've been in countries where people starved. They literally died because they didn't have enough food. And we are so lucky on where we live. But this issue, we have a lot of tension because of a world pandemic. It's been 100 years, and here we are again. People are dying. People are getting sick. We can't travel. We can't enter. You know, Thanksgiving came and gone, and we couldn't go visit our families. It's a tough time. And then we get the whole Black Lives Matter thing. I'm assuming that's part of what you're talking about. And how do we respond to this? With love. And as you were talking, I kept thinking over and over again. And I get a little emotional, I get choked up. So if I do that, you know, you'll know what's going on. All I could think of was, I have a dream that someday little black children and little white children can play together and there will be no problem. Live for that dream. Anyone else?
I have a
Was
question.
it reaching for a button? Yes, sir.
I enjoyed your talk very much, and I just wanted a question about something that you said. I understand your comments about little changes and epiphanies and change in your personal and worldview, and I'm relatively new to this, and I've had some of those, so I kind of understand what you're talking about. But I was wondering, you had said you don't consider yourself enlightened. And I was wondering just where your perspective is on that in terms of you talked about a couple of these major epiphanies in your life. You've talked about these things where your worldview and the view of yourself has changed. And what do you consider enlightened?
Well, I took some classes in my master's classes, and there was a term they used, which I really liked at the time because it was so descriptive. It was, when you're dealing with people, do they walk their talk? And I look at people talking about how wonderful they are, and that really means nothing. What you need to look at is how people live their lives. I don't consider myself enlightened as an absolute state because I still become frustrated and angry at times. Part of that is you may notice that I'm on oxygen, and I have now been on oxygen 24 hours a day since June. I don't have a breathing problem. What I have is a heart problem that only pumps about half enough oxygen at any given moment. And my doctor finally said, well, maybe you're in constant AFib because your oxygen is so low. At that time, it was 76 for any of you that know anything. And I was walking around in a grouchy mood all the time, making everybody miserable because we have somebody comes to my temple, and she's a nurse, and she said, nobody likes anybody with COPD. Well, to define what I am is just to give you a list. But the long and the short of it is, Kozin comes out here. I bark at him real bad. He and Ron were here. I went back and apologized, and he said, that's all right. I understood what was going on because your lips are blue and you need to be on oxygen. And this was about 4 years ago. So when I get to the point where I don't ever get frustrated, when I get to the point that I don't get angry like, oh, I don't like you anymore kind of stuff. It's more of frustration angry, you know, like I just tripped over my oxygen line, which I drag around the house, and I have a bottle that I carry out there. I told my doctor one time, I said, you know, first I had a bottle of oxygen. I said it was a real pain in the neck because last week I re-roofed one of the buildings at the temple, and I had to drag that oxygen bottle all over the roof at the temple, and he looked at me like I was insane. So yeah, when I get a real handle on this, I'll let you know. I think I've had some awakening experiences. I think I have a pretty good idea who I am. I'm not ready to tell anybody I'm enlightened, and by the way, I never will. I have some titles in the Vietnamese community that imply that I've had some awakening. We always say that. I like the Vietnamese because they don't say, well, he's awakened. But one of the things I was going to share is I know 3 Vietnamese monks that are quite old that I consider to be enlightened. And I don't think they have the problems that I have. You know, I think they're pretty patient and they don't get too upset. Somebody doesn't agree with them, it doesn't matter to them. I don't know. Is that a good answer? I was all over the board, I know.
Oh, but it makes sense, and it it gives some perspective on life and the reality of this is, like you say, it is a path and it is continuation. It's continuous. Enlightenment is continuous. It's not a single event.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Uh-oh. Okay, Emily.
Yeah. First, thank you. This has been a really, really enjoyable talk. I love bringing in MLK and Gandhi and just, yeah, getting really inspired. So thank you. I missed the third thing we're supposed to do. I got meditation, I got reflection, and somehow
Honesty.
honesty.
Yeah,
Okay.
we have a hard time being honest with ourselves. And you know, I do it, and I know I do it. You know, I use an excuse. Okay, I got upset and I got frustrated because I'm not getting a lot of oxygen. Well, my very nature, my father was the grumpiest man in the whole world. And my stepmother used to say I was the only one to could get him out of being so grumpy all the time. Well, I've inherited his grumpiness. So is that an excuse? Yeah, it's a recognition of the reality. Would I like to never get frustrated? Will I like to never get upset? Yeah, I would. I'm not doing very good at it. That's honesty. I'm not doing as good as I could. I live with a lady that is much more patient than I am because she's willing to accept the fact that I'm a pain in the neck a lot of times. So, honesty.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a question. If we have time, I'll make it brief.
Okay.
Buddhism, the overall concept seems to be non-duality, and yet in so much of the teachings and stories, it seems like they're constantly contrasting opposites. So I am confused about duality or non-duality.
Okay. Another really big question there, you know, but there is an ultimate essence of things. And the duality, let's see, how about race? That there's a difference because of our color. Well, that's duality. What's the reality? There really isn't a difference. I mean, we look at human beings. We're the most adaptable animal in the entire universe. We can live anywhere. We can live where it's below freezing for months on end. We can live where other animals would just die from the heat and the humidity. And yet, all we're looking at with the color of people is an adaptation to how much sun they get on a regular basis. I took a college course back in 1970, and it was a political science course, and I had to do it was a seminar where each of us had a chunk of the lesson we had to do and teach on, and I had to do the races of Africa. And I remember going through that and coming up with, there were 3 black races and the this and that, and they used nasal index, and they had all these manufactured ways of dividing people up. And yet in reality, this is just an adaptation. It's like saying, okay, those people are different than us because they wear a coat. And that's duality. The first thing is to stop creating a situation where there's difference. And good and bad is it. Good and bad are conditional. I used to ask my high school students, is it ever proper to steal? Is it ever reasonable to steal? I had a rule in my classroom, don't ever lie to me, because if you lie to me, you better go to the counselor and get out of my class. I have no toleration for people that have no respect for themselves. And the kids would look at me like I was crazy. And I said, now, if you steal, that's a different deal. This is obviously the first day orientation of my class. And they said, well, someone would say, no, it's never right to steal. I said, okay, so your little sister is starving. Would you steal bread for her? And of course, now they've made that story into a musical, right? Was that Hugo that wrote that story? I never can remember. Yeah. And I said, so would you steal bread to feed your sister? Now, see, I didn't say, would you steal bread to feed yourself? And some of them would say yes, and some would say no. I said, I'd never blame you. if you went into somebody's pack and you took out their lunch and you ate it. I wouldn't blame you. I'd have a long talk with you about getting on the lunch program, but I would understand why you did it. And I actually brought a glass of water out and haven't used it. So duality, black and white. We have a nice little sutra poem that we do, the relationship of the relative and the absolute. Everything's relative. What do you see? Every one of you is going to give me a different description. That's duality. What do you see? Take a drink of water. That would be a Zen answer. Take a drink of water. I'm not going to answer you because I know that everybody sees something different. I was listening to this guy that I'd never heard of before, Johnny Strings. I don't know if you know who he is. He's an incredible guitar player. And somebody in the room said, okay, I've had enough of that. It was on YouTube. I've discovered YouTube, by the way. I listen to banjo players and guitar players and guys how to build a. Last night I watched a thing on how to build a forge if you want to be a blacksmith. Well, I'm not planning on that, but I find it interesting. But all of this good and bad stuff, all of this I'm better than, nobody's better than anybody else. Some people are smarter. All that means they can learn better. You know, people forgot what IQs were about. You know, I love the quote of Einstein when somebody said, Dr. Einstein, you're the smartest man in the world. You're so incredible. What's it like to know everything? He says, I don't know everything. He says, I know where to look to find the answer. But they were trying to set up a thing. Nobody can be like Einstein. All of you can be like Einstein. You just may not be as big as Einstein, but you all have Einstein in you. It's like one of the things that just bothers me to death is people that tell me they can't sing. By the way, I'm a musician. They tell me they can't sing. Everybody can sing. I've met one person in my entire life, one person that was tone deaf. And that was bizarre to meet somebody that truly was tone deaf. Nobody's tone deaf because it was one person in a whole lifetime. Now, some people sing better than other people. That's a slightly different thing. But, you know, some people cook better than other people. And some people are smart. I've got a guy living at the temple now. I have to follow behind him because he wants to turn the water on trees. Now, I know you're in the middle of winter there, and you don't water the trees. Okay, so did that help? It's a constant back and forth with this duality thing.
Thank you.
And,
Roshi, thank you so much for your time. I know you've got other appointments coming up. So everybody, Candace will teach us how to applaud Roshi for his wonderful Dharma talk. Thank you.
well, you have a good rest of the retreat.
Thank you, Joe. So appreciated.
Okay, good luck.